Inheritance means somebody died. In the book of Galatians, the Apostle Paul reiterates several things that he had obviously explained to the Galatians at some earlier time, and he challenges them to recall and hold on to what he told them previously. The 3rd and 4th chapters of that epistle give the crux of the message he had already delivered to them orally. If you intend to be one of those who are saved by faith, here at the end of the age, you need to understand and believe the same things that Paul explained to the Galatians orally. I am going to explain those things to you in broad outline, but first, you need to know what Paul wrote in the 3rd and 4th chapters of his letter to the Galatians. Galatians chapter 3, verses 1 through 29, HSSB. O senseless Galatians, who has cast a spell on you, for whose eyes Jesus the Anointed One was written earlier as having been crucified? I want to learn only this from you: did you receive the Spirit on the basis of works of law, or on the basis of hearing with belief in God's promise? Are you so senseless? After starting in spirit, are you now going to finish in the flesh? Did you suffer so much for no good reason, if indeed even for no good reason? Therefore, does the one who abundantly provides the Spirit for you, and works supernaturally powerful things among you, do it on the basis of works of law, or on the basis of hearing with belief in God's promise? Just like Abraham, he believed the living God, and it was reckoned to him as a declaration of not guilty. So then you know that those who are children on the basis of belief in God's promise, these individuals are Abraham's sons. But when the Scripture saw beforehand that the living God was going to acquit the Gentiles, on the basis of belief in God's promise, it proclaimed the good news of the fulfillment of the promise earlier to Abraham, that all the Gentiles will be blessed in you. So then those who are believers on the basis of belief in God's promise, are going to be blessed along with Abraham, the one who believed God's promise. For as many as are believers on the basis of works of law are under a curse. For it has been written that anyone who does not continue on in all the things that have been written in the scroll of the law, to act in accordance with them, is completely cursed. But it is obvious that nobody is going to be acquitted by law before the living God, because the one who is blameless will live on the basis of belief in God's promise. But the law is not on the basis of belief in God's promise. On the contrary, the one who has acted in accordance with them will live by them. The Anointed One bought us back from the curse of the law, after becoming a curse for our sake, because it has been written, anyone who hangs on a tree is completely cursed, so that the blessing of Abraham could come to the Gentiles, through the Anointed One Jesus, so that we could receive the promise of the Spirit via our belief in God's promise. Brothers, I am speaking in human terms. Nevertheless, nobody disregards a validated testament of a man or adds a codicil. Now, the promises were spoken to Abraham and his seed. He does not say, and to his seeds, as to many, but as to one, and to your seed, that is the Anointed One. But this is what I am saying: the law that came into being 430 years later, does not invalidate a testament that had been validated earlier by the living God, so that it abrogates the promise. For if the inheritance is on the basis of law, it is no longer on the basis of a promise, but the living God had already granted it as a favor to Abraham, via a promise. Therefore, why the law? It was added by the hand of a mediator after directions were given via messengers, for the sake of the violations up to the time when the seed to whom the inheritance had been promised could come. Now the mediator is not for one, but the living God is one. Therefore, is the law against the promises of the living God? Certainly not. For if a law that could give life had been given, the declaration of not guilty really would be on the basis of law. But the Scripture has confined every last one of us under sin, so that the promise could be given to those who believe God's promise, on the basis of their belief in God's promise regarding Jesus the Anointed One. But before our belief in God's promise came, we were being watched over by law, being confined for the belief in God's promise that was going to be revealed. So then the law has become our childhood guide to the Anointed One, so that we could be acquitted on the basis of our belief in God's promise. But since our belief in God's promise has come, we are no longer under a childhood guide, for you are all God's sons via your belief in God's promise with regard to the Anointed One Jesus. For as many as have been baptized into the Anointed One, have slipped on, the Anointed One. There is not Jew nor Greek, there is not slave nor free man, there is not male and nipple, for you are all one in the Anointed One Jesus. So if you are part of the Anointed One, then you are Abraham's seed, heirs in accordance with a promise. It doesn't really matter one way or the other, what you choose to believe. Paul is saying in that chapter. If you can't bring yourself to admit he said inheritance of the promise supersedes the covenant God made with the sons of Israel at Mount Sinai. If that much isn't crystal clear to you, your mental circuits obviously have a short in them somewhere. If that is the case, I doubt you will even be able to see that Paul understood the Gentiles have somehow come to be heirs of the promise, through their belief in the promise. But then again, maybe you just need to read a bit more of what he said about that. Galatians chapter 4, verses 1 through 31, HSSB. So I am saying this, for as long a span of time as the heir is a toddler, he who is owner of everything does not matter any more than a slave, but he is under supervisors and managers up to the appointed time of the father. So also we, when we were toddlers, were enslaved by the elementary beliefs of the world. But when the fulfillment of the span of time came, the living God sent out his Son, who came from a woman, who came subject to law, so that he could buy back those who are subject to law, so that we could get back the adoption. So, because you are sons, the living God has sent the Spirit of his Son out into our hearts, shouting, Abba, Father! So then you are no longer a slave, but a son, but if a son, also an heir of God. But on the one hand at that time, when you did not know God, you were slaves to the things that are by nature not God's. But now, on the other hand, after coming to know God, but rather after being known by God, how can you turn back again to the weak and poor elementary beliefs from up above, to which you want to be slaves again? You are carefully watching days and months and times and annual religious cycles. I fear for you, for fear that I might have labored for you for no good reason. I am pleading with you, brothers, be like me, so that I am also like you. None of you have harmed me, but you are aware that I proclaimed the good news of the fulfillment of the promise to you previously because of an infirmity of my flesh, yet you did not view me with contempt, nor disdain your testing by my flesh, but you accepted me as a messenger of God, as you would the Anointed One Jesus. Therefore, where is your good fortune? For I am providing testimony about you that if possible, after gouging out your eyes, you would have given them to me. So then have I become your enemy by speaking the truth to you? They are eagerly seeking you, not exceptionally well, but they want to lock you out so that you eagerly seek them. Now it is always far better to be eagerly sought for what is exceptionally good, and not only while I am there with you, my children with whom I am in labor again, up to the time when the Anointed One is formed in you. But I wanted to be there with you at this time and change the tone of my voice, because I am perplexed about you. You who want to be subject to law, tell me, do you not hear the law? For it has been written that Abraham had 2 sons, one from the slave girl and one from the free woman. But one was engendered from the slave girl, in accordance with flesh, the other from the free woman, via a promise, which is what is being implied figuratively, for these individuals are two testaments. One is in fact from Mount Sinai, which is Hagar, who is engendering children into slavery. So Hagar is Sinai, a mountain in Arabia, but she lines up with the present Jerusalem, for she is a slave along with her children. But the Jerusalem above, who is our mother, is a free woman. For it has been written, "You, barren woman, the one who is not giving birth, must celebrate. You, the one who is not in labor, must let it rip and cry out, because the children of the one who was deserted are many more than the children of the one who has the man." So you, brothers, are children of a promise, corresponding to Isaac. But indeed, just as at that time, the one who was engendered in accordance with flesh, persecuted the one who was engendered in accordance with the Spirit, so also now. But what does the Scripture say? Throw out the slave girl and her son, for the son of the slave girl will definitely not inherit along with the son of the free woman. Wherefore, brothers, we are not children of a slave girl, but of the free woman. Now that I have given you my translation of the things Paul wrote in those 2 chapters, let's take a look at them logically, instead of looking at them through the illogical feel-good wine goggles that Satan has assiduously worked to fabricate, for the dimwits who control the masses in the church today. In other words, let's think a bit outside the box in which Satan has wrapped up this generation, in preparation for shipping them all off to hell in a handbasket of his own making. The following is the essence of what the Apostle Paul says in the 2 chapters of Galatians above. Galatians chapter 3, verse 2, HSSB. I want to learn only this from you. Did you receive the Spirit on the basis of works of law, or on the basis of hearing with belief in God's promise? In that simple statement, Paul has laid out the only 2 available options for attaining salvation. 1. Work for it by slavishly adhering to the law of Moses. 2. Accept it by believing the promise. Paul goes on to explain what Gentiles attain through their belief in the promise of God. Galatians chapter 3, verse 7, HSSB. So then you know that those who are children on the basis of belief in God's promise, these individuals are Abraham's sons. The scholars in the church today would most likely all contend that Paul is speaking metaphorically, when he says Gentiles have become Abraham's sons. The truth is, he is referring to the fact that Jacob gave his grandson Ephraim the privilege of carrying the name of the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So after God cut off Ephraim from corporate Israel, the name of those 3 men got all mixed up with the Gentiles. Therefore, God was obligated to take a remnant from the Gentiles, to redeem the name that those 3 carried, and in so doing also fulfill the promise that each of them had inherited from his father. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so let's take a look at the next thing Paul says to the Galatians. Galatians chapter 3, verse 8, HSSB. But when the Scripture saw beforehand that the living God was going to acquit the Gentiles on the basis of belief in God's promise, it proclaimed the good news of the fulfillment of the promise earlier to Abraham, that all the Gentiles will be blessed in you. 3 things in that verse should tell you Paul knew more than what scholars today assume was afoot. So I am going to draw your attention to the 3 things you need to pay close attention to. 1. The Scripture saw beforehand. 2. God was going to acquit the Gentiles on the basis of belief in God's promise. 3. It proclaimed the good news of the fulfillment of the promise earlier to Abraham. What Paul means by what he says in that verse will completely elude you if you don't know that. When God told him the following, Abram already held title to the promise that Paul had in mind. Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, my interim translation. Then his majesty said to Abram, Go, by yourself, away from your land, and away from your kinfolk, and away from the house of your father, to the land that I will show you. Then I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and he will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, but I will irrevocably curse the one who considers you despicable. And all the families of the ground will be blessed in you. Scholars seem to think the Lord showed up at Abram's house one day and told him he had won the lottery. What those fools fail to understand is, the Jew and Gentile dichotomy was not an issue in Abram's time, so it would make no sense for God to talk to him about Jew versus Gentile. The term Jew did not exist at that time. It derives from the name Judah and the fact that Judah was the dominant tribe in corporate Israel, after the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom were cut off from corporate Israel in 722 BC. So at the time of Abram, the dichotomy must have been between the family of Abram and everybody else. Think about it. The truth is, when God spoke to Abram, Abram already held title to the promise. That was the case because he inherited the promise from his father Terah. The Lord was merely telling him beforehand and earlier that everyone on earth, those who would later be called the Gentiles, would be able to avail themselves of the blessing in the promise that he already had in his possession. I have long since explained how Abram came into possession of the promise in the Inheritance of the Believer, Volume 1, but I am going to explain the broad outlines again a little later on in this article. For now, I need to continue pointing out the essential elements in what Paul says about it in Galatians chapters 3 and 4. He goes on to say this. Galatians chapter 3, verses 13 through 14, HSSB. The Anointed One bought us back from the curse of the law, after becoming a curse for our sake, because it has been written, anyone who hangs on a tree is completely cursed, so that the blessing of Abraham could come to the Gentiles through the Anointed One Jesus, so that we could receive the promise of the Spirit, via our belief in God's promise. Paul's point is, Jesus Christ died on the cross so that the promise would be made available to everyone, the Gentiles, and thereby fulfill the promise God made to Abram in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. Think about it. Individual Jews already had access to the promise through their adherence to the law of Moses. I will explain in the next article in this series, that they gained that access when God ratified the Old Covenant with corporate Israel at Mount Sinai, but for now you need to accept the fact that Paul knows the method of salvation provided by the law of Moses has given way to a methodology based solely on belief in the promise. That is because the curse of the law of Moses, that required the death of corporate Israel, was fulfilled when Jesus Christ died on the cross as the sole surviving member of corporate Israel. The point of what I just told you is this. When corporate Israel died on the cross on Crucifixion Day, corporate Israel ceased to exist, along with all the do this, don't do that requirements of the Old Covenant. His suffering was nothing less than the punishment that God required of corporate Israel, under the terms of the Old Covenant, so the requirements of that covenant were thereby fulfilled. But make no mistake, salvation under the terms of the New Covenant is not based on those same requirements. The author of the book of Hebrews states that, in the following passage. Hebrews chapter 8, verses 1 through 7, HSSB. But here is a summary on the basis of the things that are stated. We have a high priest like this one, the one who sat down at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, as a priestly minister of the holy things, and the tent, the one that is real, the one that his majesty pitched, not man. For every high priest is appointed, so that he may bring and present both offerings and sacrifices. Consequently, it was also necessary that this individual have something that he could bring and present. Therefore, if he were, in fact, on earth, he would not even be a priest, since those who bring and present the offerings are in accordance with law, those who serve as priest in a perfect example and shadow of the things in heaven, just as Moses had been given divine communication when he was about to finish the tent. For he declares, "See to it that you make everything in accordance with the pattern that was shown to you on the mountain." But he has now obtained a much different priestly ministry, by as much as he is also mediator of a better testament, one that has law, made on the basis of better promises. For if that first testament had been faultless, a place would not have been sought for a second testament. The Greek word I have consistently translated as mediator in my translation, carries both a powerful parabolic image, and a tremendously potent message, so make note of it. Then take a look at what the same author says in this passage. Hebrews chapter 9, verses 11 through 17, HSSB. But after the Anointed One arrived as high priest of the good things that have come into being, via the more important and more complete tent, not made by human hands, that is, not of this creation, he came into the holy things once and for all, after finding eternal redemption, not even via the blood of goats and calves, but via his own blood. For if the blood of goats, and bulls, and the ashes of a heifer, sprinkling on those who have had sexual intercourse, makes them holy with regard to the cleanness of the flesh, how much more will the blood of the Anointed One who, via an eternal Spirit, brought and presented himself to the living God unblemished, cleanse our conscience of dead works so that we may serve a living God as priests? And for this reason he is mediator of a New Testament, so that after his death occurred for his emancipation from the violations against the First Testament, those who have been invited could receive the promise of the eternal inheritance. For where there is a testament, there is a pressing need to bear the death of the one who made the bequest by the testament. For a testament is confirmed by those who are dead, since it never has the ability to convey the inheritance, when the one who made the bequest by the testament is living. That passage is clearly saying Jesus Christ made what is called a last will and testament. What is said would make no sense otherwise. In that, it agrees completely with what I explained more than 25 years ago. See, did Jesus leave a will? The Voice of Elijah, July 1991. But you need to keep in mind the things that Paul stated in the passages I have already quoted as you read what he says in this one. Galatians chapter 3, verses 15 through 19, HSSB. Brothers, I am speaking in human terms. Nevertheless, nobody disregards a validated testament of a man or adds a codicil. Now, the promises were spoken to Abraham and his seed. He does not say, and to his seeds, as to many, but as to one, and to your seed, that is, the Anointed One. But this is what I am saying. The law that came into being 430 years later, does not invalidate a testament that had been validated earlier by the living God, so that it abrogates the promise. For if the inheritance is on the basis of law, it is no longer on the basis of a promise, but the living God had already granted it as a favor to Abraham, via a promise. Therefore, why the law? It was added by the hand of a mediator, after directions were given via messengers, for the sake of the violations up to the time when the seed to whom the inheritance had been promised could come. The key to understanding what Paul had in mind when he wrote those words lies in connecting the dots between the verb that is rather routinely translated as ad a codicil, the noun that even Tyndale realized refers to a last will and testament, and the noun that even the most boneheaded translator has to admit means inheritance. Put those three words together and the logical conclusion is, Paul has just told us that God himself made a will, a testament, when he promised Abram in the following passage that his biological seed would inherit what he possessed. Genesis chapter 15, verses 1 through 21, my interim translation. After these things, the word of his majesty came to Abram in a vision, saying, You must not be afraid, Abram, I am a shield for you, what you are due is going to increase exceedingly. Then Abram said, My master, your majesty, why would you give me anything since I am going to be childless, and the designated heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus? Then Abram said, Guess what? You have not given me a seed, so guess what? A son of my house is going to take possession of my possessions. Then guess what? The word of his majesty came to him, saying, This one will not take possession of your possessions, only that one who comes out of your abdomen will take possession of your possessions. Then he brought him outside and said, Please look at the sea of waters, and count the stars, if you are able to count them. And he said to him, This is what your seed will be. Then he believed his majesty, and he reckoned it to him as a declaration of not guilty. Then he said to him, I am his majesty who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans, to give you this land to take possession of it. So he said, My master, your majesty, how will I know that I will take possession of it? Then he said to him, Take for me a 3-year-old heifer and a 3-year-old goat and a 3-year-old ram and a turtle dove and a young bird. So he got all these for him, and he cut them in two in the middle, and he put each part so as to meet its neighbor. But he did not cut the birds in two. Then the raptors came down on the dead bodies, but Abram shooed them away. Then as the sun was going down, it happened that a deep sleep fell on Abram, and guess what? An absolute terror of an intense darkness was falling on him. Then he said to Abram, Know for certain that your seed will be a temporary resident in a land that is not theirs, and they will enslave them and humiliate them 400 years. But I am also going to adjudicate their case against the nation that they work for, and after that, they will go out with a large amount of personal property. But you will go to your fathers in peace. You will be buried at a good old age. But after a 4th generation they will return here, because the reprehensible activity of the Amorite will not be complete until then. Then the sun went down and there was a nether darkness. Then guess what? There was a smoking oven and a torch of fire that passed between these split pieces. On that day, his majesty cut a legal agreement with Abram, saying, I will give your seed this land, from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the Euphrates River, the Kenite, and the Kenizzite, and the Cadmonite, and the Hittite, and the Perizzite, and the Rephaim, and the Amorite, and the Canaanite, and the Girgashite, and the Jebusite. Paul's point in Galatians chapter 3, verses 15 through 19, should be self-evident to anyone who wants to understand. When God promised Abram he would give his seed all the land from the Nile to the Euphrates, it was in the context of him telling Abram that his biological seed would inherit his possessions. The point that one should not overlook is, the promise that God made to Abram on that occasion became a part of Abram's possessions. But the kicker in the hand that God dealt Abram is this. He promised he would die as a sacrifice before he would fail to keep the promise he made that day. That is precisely what he did. in the person of Jesus Christ. That is the significance of the sacrifices that he told Abram to prepare. In those days, sacrificing an animal was a customary way to swear an oath against one's own life. The simple act of sacrifice is what turned God's promise regarding the promised land into the last will and testament that Paul mentions. The author of the book of Hebrews also mentioned those things in the two passages I showed you above, but he states the matter succinctly in the following passage, where he is referring to the promise that God made in Genesis chapter 22, verses 15 through 18. Hebrews chapter 6, verses 9 through 20, HSSB. But beloved brothers, we are convinced of the things that are better for you, even those things that hold salvation, even if we are speaking like this. For the living God is not immoral to forget your work and the love that you presented as evidence to his name, after serving, and while serving the holy ones. But we desire that every one of you present the same concern for others as evidence with regard to the absolute certainty of the hope up to the time of the consummation, so that you are not sluggish, but imitators of those who are going to inherit the promises via belief in God's promise and patience. For after making a promise to Abraham, since he did not have anybody more important to swear an oath against, the living God swore an oath against himself, saying, while blessing, I will certainly bless you, and while increasing, I will increase you. And so, after being patient, he gained possession of the promise. For men swear an oath against the most important thing, and for them the end of every dispute is the oath for confirmation. By which oath, the living God, who was a lot more determined to show the unchangeableness of his decision to the heirs of the promise, became a mediator by an oath. So that, by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for the living God to lie, we who have taken refuge to hold on to the hope that is lying before us would have a mighty encouragement, which hope we have as an anchor of our soul both certain and confirmed, and one that comes into the inner side of the curtain, where Jesus went in as a scout for our sake, after becoming a high priest in the age to come in accordance with the order of Melchizedek. There's that word mediator again. It actually refers to someone who is a go-between, that is, it refers to someone who brings two parties together in some way. Interesting concept, isn't it? The Greek term could be applied in a variety of ways, but in every instance where you find the noun and its cognate verb used to refer to Jesus Christ, it is pointing to the fact that God fulfilled his promise to die if that were necessary for him to fulfill every other part of the promise that Abram possessed. Paul refers to Christ's role as mediator in this passage from Ephesians. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 1 through 16, HSSB. And you are those who were dead in your transgressions and your sins, in which you walked at one time, in agreement with the current age of this world, in agreement with the ruler of the authority of the air, the spirit of the one who is now working in the sons of apathy, among whom we all at one time also conducted ourselves, in the selfish desires of our flesh, while acting in accordance with the will of our flesh and understanding, and were by nature also children of anger, like the rest of the sons of apathy. Then the living God, who is wealthy in mercy, because of his copious love with which he loved us, also made us those who were dead in our transgressions, alive together in the Anointed One. You are those who have been saved as a favor, and raised us up together and seated us together with those who are in heaven, in the Anointed One Jesus, so that, in the ages that are going to come, he might present us as evidence of the incredible wealth of his favor in his benevolence for us in the Anointed One Jesus. For because of his favor you are those who have been saved via belief in God's promise, and this offering of God is not because of you, not on the basis of works, so that no one could boast. For we are what he made, those who have been created in the Anointed One Jesus, for good works, those good works that the living God prepared beforehand, so that we would walk in them. Wherefore, remember that you were at one time the Gentiles in flesh, those who are called uncircumcised by what is called the circumcision, made in flesh by human hands. Because you were at that time separate from the Anointed One, estranged from the citizenship of Israel, and strangers to the testaments of the promise, those who did not have a hope and were without God in the world. But now, in the Anointed One Jesus, you who were at one time far away have come to be near because of the blood of the Anointed One. For he is our peace, the one who made both of us one and undid the partition wall of the hedge, the hostility in his flesh, after abrogating the law of the commandments in decrees, so that in himself he could create the two into one new man who makes peace, and he could completely reconcile both of them to the living God in one body, via the cross, after killing the hostility in himself. The only two instances where the death of God is graphically depicted as being that of a sacrificial offering are in Genesis chapter 15, verses 7 through 10, and Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 through 18. But the point of what Paul has said about God as a mediator in Galatians chapter 3, verses 19 through 20, can be easily overlooked if you do not know he committed himself to being a mediator, when he declared corporate Israel to be his firstborn son. That is, he did so knowing full well that by unifying the promise and making it the possession of corporate Israel, the curses of the Mosaic covenant that he placed on corporate Israel would eventually fall on him alone when he became corporate Israel. In Galatians chapter 3, verses 15 through 20, Paul is so focused on the fact that the law of Moses cannot invalidate God's promise to Abram, that he fails to point out the fact that the promise of God has several different component parts, even though he has already referred to several of them. That characteristic of the promise is important to recognize, simply because the original content of the promise never changes, it merely gains additional detail. It should be obvious that the promised land is only one of the constituent parts of the promise, in light of the fact that all the families of the earth were included as heirs in Genesis chapter 12, and additional elements were added to the promise in Genesis chapters 17 and 22. Consequently, it would be a huge mistake for anyone to overlook the fact that the last will and testament, in which Abram and his seed were named as heirs in Genesis chapter 15, is not concerned with the inheritance of just the promise. It is instead concerned with promising Abram that his biological seed would eventually inherit what was promised. It should be obvious that the most valuable thing that Abram possessed was the original promise of God, which had already been handed down to him as an inheritance before God spoke to him on the occasion described in Genesis chapter 12. But what is not so obvious is the fact that Paul goes on in Galatians chapter 3, to mention the single most important element in the promise when he says this. Galatians chapter 3, verses 24 through 29, HSSB. So then the law has become our childhood guide to the Anointed One, so that we could be acquitted on the basis of our belief in God's promise. But since our belief in God's promise has come, we are no longer under a childhood guide, for you are all God's sons, via your belief in God's promise with regard to the Anointed One Jesus. For as many as have been baptized into the Anointed One, have slipped on, the Anointed One. There is not Jew nor Greek, there is not slave nor free man, there is not male and nipple, for you are all one in the Anointed One Jesus. So if you are part of the Anointed One, then you are Abraham's seed, heirs in accordance with a promise. In Galatians chapter 4, Paul goes on to explain how everyone who believes the promise of God becomes both a son of Abraham and a child of God. In so doing, He rings the changes of yet another facet of the promise that was explained in more detail in the time of Jeremiah and Ezekiel, but I will talk about that at some later date. For now, it is enough that you know the opportunity to become a child of God has been a part of the promise from the very beginning. So I will start at the very beginning.